started. For the panel discussion, Ulla, Terry, Jim, and Magnus are in front of you, as Ulla should catch a ferry in about 7 minutes' time. Then we have perhaps a few questions to Ulla, or actually we have a question to all the participants or all the keynote speakers. And the question would be, what impressions do you as panelists, as keynote speakers and chair of the EATAW have about the conference and academic writing issues discussed here? And let's give the floor first to Ulla.
Thank you, Kärt, very much. Couple points. First of all, fabulous organization of the conference, Kärt, and the organizing committee.
And the team.
And my wonderful assistant, Helle, thank you so much for helping. I just found the diversity of the papers, the diversity of presenters so interesting. We've heard presentations by teachers from all over the world, and also we've heard presentations about students at so many different levels. We've heard about graduate students, undergraduate students, faculty, postdocs, etc. We've heard about first language, second language English academic writing. So we've also had a diversity of theories and approaches that have been discussed here, coming from areas of language and linguistics and composition, rhetoric and education, which is fabulous, but also brings up complexities with it. We use a variety of terms here, which we use a little differently, translanguaging, multilingualism, etc. And from that point of view, I think it's great to have these varieties and all this discussion, but it would be really nice to see in the future years how we define them, how we define them from our perspectives, which also then brings me to my last point, of course, as an intercultural rhetoric person, someone who has, spent my teaching life and scholarly life of studying social and cultural educational backgrounds of the L2 students who I teach, that we've heard so much about L2 students, L1 students, but have we heard a lot about what kinds of L2 students do we have? Who are they? Where do they come from? Do we know much about their educational, social, and cultural backgrounds? Of course, we have to know our students individually too, but I believe, and especially just learned so much about what's happening at European universities with your large multilingual student populations now, that listening to the patients, learning about them, helps us target our instruction and our communication, which then leads into better outcomes too. That's what I would like to say, but I thank you very much, and I thank you very much for all of your wonderful presentations and for these very, very rich, full 3 days.
Thank you. We would
and with that, I
also like to thank Ulla. We have a token of gratitude from the conference, which is actually an Estonian art kind of little piece. It's a silver pendant inspired from a rose window of the Haapsalu Dome Church, and the rose window is characteristic of Gothic and Roman styles, not actually present in England. So that can I give you a token of gratitude now that you can take with you?
Thank you all very much.
Yes.
An empty chair. She did nothing.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So the same question still. What impressions do you as panelists have about the conference?
I don't know if you can hear me, but I would like to just say ditto to everything that Ulla just said. Thank you so much. This is actually the first time I've come to an EATAW conference. I've been meaning to come in the past, but I've had conflicts with my family reunions, of all things, which are typically at the same time. And as Ulla said, I'm aware of the rich work, writing research work that's going on in Europe and have read a lot of it. So hearing the panels and hearing research in progress was really quite wonderful for me. Thank you, and thank you, Kärt.
Yes, Magnus?
Well, I'll add to that, or I agree with what's been said so far. I think we can also add, I've been at EATAW conference since 2005. So we see, on the one hand, new faces coming in. John talked about the traveling circus, and fine, it's a traveling circus. But we also get new people coming in, presentations or projects that we can follow from one conference to the next conference, which is extremely rewarding. What is also worthwhile saying, I think, and taking up the notion of diversity and the complexity that comes with it. All of our presentations, all of our projects and studies are extremely situated, of course, which is demanding. It takes an awful lot of contextualization, and initially that can be frustrating until you start rethinking what it is that you do. Try to really listen. Try to adapt, or for that matter, empathize with that other situation, and get a new angle on what it is that you're doing at home. That happens at the EATAW conference. Jim.
Yes, thank you. Jim?
Well, I want to start by saying that I think I'm going to find this question rather difficult to answer, and I think I might find all the questions rather difficult to answer, I suspect. The reason I find this one a bit difficult to answer is that I feel as though I've been so kind of tied up in managing myself and my own kind of part and presentations and workshops and things that I haven't done justice really to the range of presentations and other activities that have been going on. So I've had glimpses of what's happening. So that's why I find it quite hard to come through with a very coherent response. I mean, an example of that is that I've never really caught up with the book of abstracts, unfortunately. I've sort of wanted to kind of study them very carefully before I arrived each morning and choose where I went. And very often I just found myself kind of going along with the nearest crowd of people that were kind of going somewhere. I don't think that's a very kind of, organized way to kind of find your way through. So, but what I have noticed through that odd process is actually, to my surprise, I've found a lot of similarity rather than lots of diversity. Now, that may be my own blindness. I may not be recognizing the diversity. But I've encountered a lot of people talking about the same kinds of things that I've been talking about with colleagues in my context, and I hear other people talking about in other contexts. So I've been impressed by the similarities across people's contexts. That isn't to deny the distinctions and the diversity, but it is to recognize that I've been surprised at how much we're all dealing with similar kinds of institutional and pedagogic situations, trying to kind of find collaborators that we can work with. Some people, it's been quite interesting, some people are actually working clearly in very well-established collaborations with subject specialists. I suppose that's the distinction, and some people don't have that opportunity. That's quite interesting. I'd be very keen to know how come some people get that, and how come other ones of us have got to fight for it. So that's, I suppose, I mean, I've really enjoyed it, and I have really appreciated the feedback that I personally have, that I've had, and I felt as though I was engaging in dialogue with people when I had the opportunities. But I think there's a lot more depth to this than I've been able to find yet.
Thank you. Before we get to the questions that the delegates have put into the box, I have a few compulsory questions. Hopefully we will be able to answer these
And
as
they're behind
well.
our back.
So I have a question here to everybody in the panel. What are the key issues of teaching academic writing today?
In 30 seconds.
You go first.
I go first. What are
Yeah,
the
it's
key
like
issues?
a game, you know. You don't see the question and then you have to respond.
You do the
very
next question
quickly.
then. What are the key issues in teaching academic writing today? What are the key issues in teaching academic writing today? There's a choice of issues, and my selection is likely to be affected by where I'm at. My first key issue would be level of engagement with writing students and faculty alike. The second issue would be process. The third issue would be what Jim talked about, the fact that we can, when we get together and work with faculty, we can use writing to form, to mediate knowledge and reality. 3 things.
Thank you. Jim or Terry?
No, Terry was to do the next question.
Oh, you want all of us to answer this
Shall
question?
we have the next?
No, I'm just kidding.
I'm happy to say that in the United States, one of the key issues for composition people, teachers and researchers, is as we become more internationalized, we've always had multilingual students, but now we're finally recognizing that they're really here. And I think that composition scholars have not typically in the US been trained in the kinds of language and linguistics practices and applied linguistics that so many of you have that expertise. So that I see as one of the challenges. I think in the US we have a rich tradition of writing in the disciplines and that kind of research. So that for me is not one of the key issues. It's the language diversity.
Thank you. Jim, would you?
I'm not sure if you just said this, Terry, but one that occurs to me, which seems to have occurred in different places, is how subject specialists can take on the approaches which we have developed, we as language specialists or as writing specialists have developed awareness of. So I think there seems to be a big kind of issue around how to share the insights that we've gathered through our work, I suppose both with subject teachers and also with students as well, in kind of coherent ways. I've mentioned the sort of partnershiping thing, which I suppose is related to that. I think for me, an area which I confess I haven't got much experience with, and I think a lot of people here have got more, is about peer tutoring and the role of peers in the student body working with other students. I must confess, I've always had a question around that of how those peers actually work. What is it that they bring to the relationship? What are their insights? What's their skills? What's their expertise? Considering that lots of us have spent, I mean, many of us here may be peers, I may be peer tutors, but it's taken me a long time to kind of understand how writing works in higher education. I'm interested in what it is that peers bring, and you can see that I haven't got the experience. I think a lot of you have. So I think that's another interesting issue for me, is the role of peer tutors. I suspect there's lots of other issues which don't come into my mind at the moment, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. So, the next question I have here. So, what are the challenges and perspectives? So, in line with the title of the conference, what are the challenges and perspectives of teaching academic writing in different contexts? What are the challenges and perspectives?
I'll pick up on what Jim said, and that is how you establish those partnerships with faculty across disciplines, which is critical and essential to writing across the curriculum work, and to build that network of supporters and people that are deeply invested in writing. And there are many, many in our institutions from different fields, to find them, to reward them. And the challenge is that as faculty are increasingly asked to do more and more, faculty in the disciplines at my institution, for example, Research One institution, now the emphasis is on research, that they have to do their own research. And so students come somewhere down below in that order. And so for me at that institution, and I think at many institutions in the US, that is an enormous challenge.
Yes. Jim?
Well, I think I listed about a dozen challenges on my, my slides, so I don't really want to repeat those. Yeah. I think the one challenge that I kind of go away with, still wondering, and there were a couple of people who picked this up after my presentation, it is that I presented an approach and insights that came from a particular context, and it was an Anglophone context. And I wanted to know how it resonated for people in multilingual and plurilingual contexts, in more multilingual and plurilingual contexts than I'm in. And a few people did respond to that. That still remains for me a challenge to understand the challenge of plurilingualism. I was in a project for a couple of years which was developing plurilingual competence descriptors, so that it was actually possible to evaluate students' performance of plurilingual repertoires, which I thought was a very extremely difficult thing to do. And unfortunately, because of the nature of competence descriptors, it generated loads and loads of taxonomies of descriptions, which are quite hard to deploy. And it felt like it was a multi-dimensional chess game we were playing with these descriptors across multiple languages. So I don't know how far people feel as though you have progressed in handling plurilingualism as a reality for many students and many teachers in Europe. But I suspect that's a central key challenge for us across Europe.
Magnus?
I'm going to be repeating at least partly what Jim and Terry have been saying. Most of my work happens in a sort of integrated, embedded context. We work a lot with more or less intensive team teaching situations with content faculty. So fine, that is a challenge. It is time consuming. It takes a fair amount of negotiation of what you want to be doing in those teams. And fine, that's a challenge. What I think is more of a challenge is many of us, all of us, most of us are quite comfortable in our sort of writing course, writing class, writing workshop, whatever it is, with our various frameworks and models. But there are only so many of us, and there are far more subject lecturers. It has to happen. It has to happen among the subject lecturers. We have to find systemic elements in our university structures. We have to find promotional elements in our university structures to make that happen. So that's a sort of policy level. But even then, my understanding of the model or my use of models really doesn't transfer very well always. So I need to find ways of simplifying it and still making it effective for that faculty member who sits in one of my writing courses. Colleague and I work a lot with the PhD level writers at our university, say half of whom or a third of whom continue on to become instructors later on, or a year or so later. That's a sort of a good crowd of people to have. But it's not as if we're talking writing theory there. We just need to make it effective. And that's a challenge. That's difficult.
Okay, thank you.
This one is yours, Jim.
Thank you. What are the goals for academic writing, both for students and instructors? So the goals for
Effortless
both
writing.
students and instructors.
Well,
Anything to add here?
I mean, I sort of feel as though that's what I tried to present on, really, is that academic writing is meaning-making. So the point of academic writing, and again, Terry spoke about it in her presentation this morning, is, and from the interviews that you had, and I don't quite know how people, because I don't work in a writing centre myself, and I don't quite know how people in writing centres do bridge into the disciplines. I mean, I guess there's lots of different formulations of that. But I think that academic writing doesn't exist on its own. It's not anything unless it's making academic meanings. And so how that works seems to me to be what academic writing is about. And I think that perhaps is the biggest question for us, is how does academic writing do academic work? It's not just, as your respondent said, I think, Terry, it's not just something that you can do on the side. It's got to be happening at the heart of the business. But on the other hand, we're not all at the heart of the business. We are actually working on the margins quite often. So then what do we do?
And in the margins.
Yes. Terry, any?
Well, I'm wondering if I can respond to something Jim said.
Yes.
Because I did direct a pretty large university writing center at my institution. And Jim said, how do you get peers to talk to each other across disciplines, or even sometimes in the same disciplines? But in the same way that, we write to figure out what we think, we also talk to figure out what we think. And so you have those tutors engage the student writer in conversation about what their goals are, what the teachers want them to do, how do they understand what it is the teacher's asking them to do, how do they make sense of that. And those are conversations that tutors are, and I'm using tutors here as typically graduate students or undergraduates, they're very capable, if they're good listeners, of asking those questions and having students talk about it, and that then brings a certain kind of clarity for the students. And I've observed so many writing sessions over the years, at least 50, 60 every year. So I can see the effectiveness of that kind of engaged listening.
It's my turn, is it?
Yes, Magnus.
Again, difficult to find much to add. I guess it becomes more of rephrasing, but I'd like to add to Jim's notion of if academic writing isn't anything in itself, there needs to be content. So, at least in my world, the goal would be to empower sort of learning. More than anything.
Actually,
Yes.
I thought I attended a conference in England, the BALIT conference, which is the EAP Teachers Conference, and there was a debate there about what is the disciplinary credentials, if you like, behind academic writing as a practice, as a university practice. And I think there was a sense that there's a way to go, or there is a need to go towards some place where academic writing, and maybe this is in the States where you have professors of rhetoric and such things, where academic writing has got status which is equal to subjects teaching and has got a disciplinary background to it. I don't know if anyone's come across Carl Mayton's work on legitimation code, which is the notion of how do subjects gain their legitimacy and from where does that come? And I think there's questions of legitimacy about academic writing and its position in the university, which may or may not be served by building or clarifying what the disciplinary base for that, for our work is. So,
Well, I think I mean, there is a discipline that is academic writing. That's a disciplinary field. We work in it. But most of our students are not writing in it. Most of our students come from somewhere else.
Okay, so it's interesting to think what are the parameters of this disciplinary field of...
And how can we do our job better?
Of academic writing as a discipline.
Right.
And writing in the disciplines is a field in the US, and writing across the curriculum. So what I think is, though, as a challenge is that as we seek that legitimation that you're talking about, is that we do more research, we do more theorizing, we do more of that kind of work, and then some perceive that as, wait, you're not attending to students now. And so what's happened here? And so I think that that's always the tension when you're teaching and then also theorizing your practices.
Thank you. And now the last question, and let's see whether there is anything you would like to add. Perhaps it's like, I'm going to rephrase. What issues of academic writing would you want to highlight in the EATAW context?
L1.
Yes, I was going to say the same as well. I'm not sure how much that's come into focus in this conference. I mean, obviously I'm coming from an English language environment, and all the presentations I've been to, that I've personally been to, I think have been dealing with English, at least English medium contexts. So that leaves a big dark area for me of what's happening in L1 contexts.
Yes. I would agree with that. And it's not as prevalent in the US because we're supposedly an English medium country, but that's clearly not the case. And so what is happening in all those different L1s in the US that we just need to know about.
All right, Magnus?
And, well, maybe if I could add, not just L1, but how can we use L1 writing, academic writing or writing development towards, because many of us are also in an EMI context. So how does it sort of inform or empower a student in an EMI context as well? How can we use L1 contexts?
And I think another issue which we on the board have kind of tried to address, and which was also brought up at the Budapest EATAW conference, is the place of research in relationship to academic writing. And I think that remains a question from me through this conference. And I know we've got a question from the floor about the relationship, and you just spoke about it too, Terry, between research and academic writing. And I don't think we've clarified that in any kind of very strong ways. You know, what research processes and methods are we using in our engagement with academic writing? Or are we primarily practitioners, with research kind of being a little thing on the side, or not even not there really? I mean, I think those are questions which EATAW could usefully grapple with more full on.
Thank you. And now we can get to the questions that were given that were put in the box by the delegates. Shall I read the question and then see? Do you have any examples of successful institutional support for academic writing workshops for lecturers from different disciplines, which helped make them aware of differences or similarities in disciplinary conventions or requirements of academic writing? And what is good, what is bad? Do you remember the beginning of the question?
And that's a short one.
I read that question, so I'd like to say something about that. I always think about the carrot and the stick, because we have an institutional mandate in the state of Virginia to assess students on several different competencies, one of those being writing. And so that enabled me to say, well then, if I'm going to be involved in this assessment effort, we'll do it in the disciplines, and this is how we'll do it. We'll bring faculty to the table in the same departments, in the same fields, and they'll talk about writing. They'll look at student writing, they'll look at some samples from writing, upper division writing intensive courses, and we'll build a rubric together. And those rubrics, if you look at them, they look similar in that same sort of set of general terms, but they've talked about what those terms mean, and they've articulated them in various ways, and they see where they've had agreements and disagreements. And then we also have brought faculty together from different fields in what we call the trainer workshops, and those, the faculty are like, wow, it is so different. It's so different when we score the same paper and then talk about why our scores are different for them and our perceptions are different.
And we have copied some of that in our context. And maybe one thing that I can add from a Swedish context is the Diploma of Higher Education. In order to get a permanent position in Swedish higher education, you need 15 credits of pedagogics, basically. And most of the time you get hired and you get to promise that I'll do that within 2 years. Tends not to happen, but you won't get promoted until it's happened. So there's a bit of a carrot and a stick element to that. But what it has generated, along with, I must admit, the Bologna descriptors that require communication at the various cycles, it's generated faculty writing courses, faculty course development courses, and it's impossible to avoid writing strategies in a course like that. And we get the type of effects that you mentioned. I am not involved in the type of grading seminars yet, but we have some of those as well.
Yeah.
But that course has been very effective.
What's interesting when I do these workshops with faculty, the assessment workshops, they say, this was fun. Because you'd say, you're not grading papers. You're not talking about how bad students are. You're talking about what you want to see and what you do see in those papers. And they don't have an opportunity to do that very often.
I haven't run many cross-faculty workshops of that nature. I've run a couple, and I didn't really think it brought out the kind of disciplinary differences which I think actually exist. I noticed, again, going back to this EAP conference that I was recently at, that there's quite an interesting situation, again in the UK context, for teachers who are working in pre-sessional EAP courses, which actually are full of students coming from across the disciplines. And I think that's quite an interesting context to start kind of grappling maybe with what cross-disciplinary contrasts look like. But that's with students rather than with faculty, with staff. I do remember an event when I was explaining to a group of people in a multidisciplinary context what academic writing was from my point of view, and I mentioned the word argument in the process. And there was a woman, a colleague from the science faculty sat next to me, and she said, "Oh, well, we don't want to do academic writing then." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, we don't do argument in science." And I found that quite interesting, and she was also very prickly, and I felt as though this was kind of like not a very, nice kind of communication we were having. Turned out later we became best colleagues, but she had the conviction that in science they don't do argument, we don't do argument, and I found that interesting because we'd already just made some materials based on science materials because we base our writing work on course materials. And we specifically used some science materials to demonstrate argument. So it didn't actually stack up. And I suppose as time's gone on, and I've worked more with her, I've seen that it's true, there is a kind of emphasis, certainly at level 1, year 1, to work with more factual, categorical kind of texts rather than the perspectival ones that I was talking about. But I think it would be very interesting to bring together people from different disciplines to talk about their sense of their disciplines. I think that would be a really sharpening way of understanding it. And in fact, I must think about how to do that when I go away from here.
So perhaps this next question is related to what you were just saying. So reaching agreement with subject lecturers about what appropriate academic writing is a time-consuming process and not always successful. And the question is, could peer tutoring initiative be more effective, for example, master level students tutoring bachelor level students and so on, undergraduates?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Particularly, well, yes, the peer tutor writing center works on that notion, so fine, absolutely. But perhaps even more so in other contexts where we have programs that progress over 2 or 3 years, and bringing in those senior students into the junior courses or the freshman courses, etc. Because they are in the same subject area context as well, so you get the two. So absolutely.
Yes, Jim?
I think it depends on our objectives. If our objectives are to support some individual students to make progress, then I think peer tutors can take that role on. But if our objectives are to engage in dialogue with subject specialists about the nature of academic writing in their subjects, I think that there's a risk that that approach, if that becomes the only approach, will leave that dialogue out of the equation and will leave us on the margins of our institutions doing something which is, you know, nice and helpful and so on, but isn't actually engaging with what the university is really about, which is teaching subjects. So I think there is that side of the debate to consider.
There is another model too, which are course embedded tutors, and so you put a writing tutor into a course and they work with the professor and help translate some of what the teacher is saying to the students in the course, and sometimes that works really well. Other times teachers want to see that person as a grader for the students. So it's always, when you're doing any kind of work with tutors, they have to be very well trained.
There's also, well, there are also models, sort of guerrilla warfare models with undercover lecturers in subject departments. So that works too.
Right, thank you. So the next question would be, I would like to address writing and supervision pedagogy. Is that?
Say again, please.
Supervision, I'm not sure whether I can read the handwriting.
This is your question, Terry.
Sorry? Is the author here? Perhaps it would be better to ask it, or just correct me if I'm wrong. I would like you to address writing and supervision pedagogy. Maybe this is a question for Terry. Students want explicit conversation advice as analytical moves in their drafts. But how often will that be possible and available to supervisors? Maybe there is a kind of writing expertise now available in books, like Swale's Good Guides to Writing a PhD, which is not available to most supervisors. I mean, if you really want rhetorical expertise to help you, who and what should be your resources? We can't all have Swales.
Well, the students could all have Swales, I suppose. I think if the supervisors would read some of those moves and be thinking about how they work. But as I said in my talk, I think it's really how to make the tacit come to the fore, and those are conversations that if you can get the supervisors to have those conversations, the supervisors that my colleague and I interviewed are very keen actually on talking about how they can talk about writing. And we had a symposium, or colloquia, a half-day colloquia. We had 50 supervisors there. They weren't paid for that or anything, but they want to do better. They want to keep their students. So I think it comes back to me for conversations.
And in that conversation emerges, I hope, a shared terminology, a shared sort of conceptual framework for it. Can I just add to what you were saying about supervisors? I'm at a research University of Technology, and one of our departments has been incredibly successful in generating research funding for graphene. It's the sort of European graphene kind of center. The supervisors in that department have experienced a completely different role in this past, 2 years. They are now in charge of really large projects, very, very, very many PhD students, research assistants, postdocs. They hardly do any of the research. They do all of the writing supervision. And they come into this writing course, this higher education diploma course, precisely for the type of tools and frameworks, in order to do their job in a less time-consuming manner, with a greater sense of what they're doing. So that their reality is changing as well.
Thank you, Jim.
No, I don't have any thoughts on that one.
No. Right. So Jim has 2 more questions.
Well,
yes?
these are ones that have come from the floor. The first one is, how can we further increase participation from other parts of the world beyond Europe and North America? And there's a sub-question to that, but I think probably good to take them in turn. So how can we further increase participation from other parts of the world beyond Europe and North America? I mean, I'd be quite interested to know why we'd want to do that. I mean, what is it that we'd actually be looking to other parts of the world for? So the person who asked that question might like to say. I don't know, Magnus, you've been a bit more involved from the chairing of the board, from thinking about the scope of the of EATAW, perhaps, would you say?
We haven't made, and you've been part of those conversations too, Jim, in the past few years, but we haven't made a very sort of explicit or strong effort or statement towards attracting from all over the world, for I think 2 reasons. Perhaps the most obvious reason is the European focus. The other one would be there are other conferences, other networks that perhaps offer a better forum for it than EATAW currently does. We have wanted it to have a core of European and invite as much as possible that we've been able to.
And I think it's been a question of cost as well. I mean, if you're actually wanting to appeal across the world, there's a lot of cost of travel involved in that. And I think often when we've been involved in choosing locations for EATAW conferences, there's always been a consideration about what will the cost be for people coming from particular parts of the world. So I think that may be considered. Anyway, related to that is the other one, which I think has come up already a bit. How can we move beyond an Anglophone focus even more? And I mean, a thought that crosses my mind is that, because yesterday in the General Assembly, there was a kind of review of the elections and of the languages, I think, of the people who were elected. And I think it's still dominated by first language English speakers. I'm not sure if that's quite the case.
2, 3.
So, but the point I want to make is that more people coming forward who aren't coming from Anglophone type environments to stand for the board would actually begin to shift perhaps some of the focus of the association. Would that be fair to say?
Very possibly, yes. And right into our call for papers, etc. Set up sessions in L1s. Well, in any language technically, but in Budapest we had a number of sessions in German, if I remember correctly. We had 1 session in French, I think. And make that an explicit objective of the conferences. We have made room for it, but we haven't emphasized it.
I think if there was a kind of strong voice on the discussion list that was expressing that sort of position, then the board, as the kind of organizers of the conference, as the supporters of the organizers of the conference, I think would have a stronger position to push that perspective. I think there does seem to be a little bit of a default to an Anglophone sort of context, or at least an English-speaking context.
We had actually 1 presentation in German, so that we were encouraging people to submit proposals. But yes, perhaps in the future then more of that is going to happen.
Yeah,
or simply making it more explicit.
Yes,
there will
explicit.
Be sessions in.
There is another question? Yeah. And this is the last one, I think. This is quite a pertinent one. Dear members of the panel, do you share my idea that the conversation between theory, research and practice at the EATAW conference can, 1, be improved by specifying different types of presentations in the program in terms of their position, I think position, research, policies and practices. I think it means identifying whether their focus is on research, on policy or on practice. In other words, to create themes, because there are themes in the conference.
There are themes, but not in that
but not in that of that
yes.
kind. And this would bring into focus the role of research, the role of practice, and the role of policy as parts of the EATAW concern. So that's okay. Well, and organising the articulation of needs for research and theorising by practitioners. So I think it's again trying to emphasise. The question is trying to emphasise that there is a recognition of research, there is a recognition of practice, and there is a recognition of policy as perspectives. Alongside that, by offering seminars or training meetings next to the conference presentations. I'll just go through the questions. The implicit assumption is it needs improvement. Well, okay, so I think there's an implicit criticism there. Personally, I am both a practitioner and a researcher. And there's a name, but I won't read out the name, unless the person wants me to. Oh, they do. It's Kees. The second name, Kees? De Glopper. Do you want to speak to that a little yourself, to articulate it more?
Yes. And maybe it's a personal unease, because in many presentations, sometimes the research presentations, I often want to know, okay, what are the implications for teaching, for my teaching, and on the other hand there are presentations where I expect research and there is not so much research, but there are reports on practice, and I value both. So what I'm not trying to convey is a sort of priority or preference from me personally for research presentations, but I'm sometimes a bit surprised by presentations that are suggesting research but not offering, or suggesting practical implications but not offering them. And I think perhaps EATAW could be a stronger conference with more explicit conversation between practice and research by making more clear in the program structure or in labeling of presentations what the focus is essentially of what people are doing.
I think that's a very interesting idea. Are you interested in hosting the next conference?
Yes.
Yes. Well, actually, yes, I could say we are, but in 2 years' time, we are already hosting a very similar conference on discourse studies in Groningen. We might offer doing it in 4 years' time, but we have a colleague from Leuven, which is in Belgium. I'm not sure if Jordi Heeren is still here. Is Jordi here?
Do you have any more questions?
No, that's the last one.
But I sure, at some point in the, well, we hosted the first conference.
Could I just say though, Kärt, because I think you want to wrap this up, is it come to the end of the panel now?
No, we have some questions from the
Oh,
audience.
first of all, okay. I actually think it's a very interesting idea. I think it would actually, my personal view is it would actually help if the conference did kind of define those themes in terms of research, practice and policy. That might actually make quite interesting themes. The last quick thought for me is you suggest about offering seminars and training meetings next to the conference. Actually, that was a theme again at Budapest. The idea was to try to promote research as a much stronger part of the EATAW kind of approach. And I think we haven't managed to really find a critical mass to kind of put that in place, those kinds of schools, those kinds of pre-conference schools or post-conference schools. So again, I think it's a question of whether there's sufficient interest from members for such a thing to seem worthwhile. It's a lot, as we know, it's a huge amount of work to put a conference together, and this just kind of extends the workload. But it's a good idea.
It is indeed a good idea to be more explicit with what we expect from the various, or what can be expected from the various presentations. It does do something to the review process. It does require completely different criteria for the abstract review,
yes,
etc.
I would agree with that.
So we need to review that entire process for the next conference, which is worthwhile.
And now the questions, please.
Not all at once.
It's your opportunity. Yes, Ken, I see you moving already. Ken, microphone.
Oh gosh.
I had the opportunity to talk to your colleague, and you've mentioned now about the importance of going into the faculties. Yeah.
Oh, the importance of
going into the faculties and integrating with them. And I'm curious, what sort of a process was it, and how long did it take? Because we're just beginning it in Helsinki.
And I have, what, 30 seconds?
I know.
No, you can take your time.
There are a number of factors that have influenced the way in which we have done it. The very first one, and perhaps the most important one, historically, was that we were lucky to be around when they started 9 new programs at the university. So we were in day one in terms of planning, in terms of curricular design, etc. And in those 9 programs, we are fairly solid. That works fairly well. Of course, things can be improved. In the programs that were already in place, 20 years ago, things have been slower, but we've been able to work from the sort of insights from those new programs and make sort of progress in the newer ones. The other component has been, well, one of the other components has been that we have, since '94, been part of the management group of the university or the college that we're in. So we've been able to talk to the people at those types of tables. Since 2004, we keep getting demoted, but we sort of have established a presence in those first 10 years. But let's be honest, it takes a good, and I think Andreas is still here, and he has been part of that process very definitely. It takes a good 3 years to establish that type of collaboration with faculty. And we have cherished it. They have been good relationships, but today, after a number of years of doing it, perhaps we need to do the type of work where we establish a course of design or faculty training, but we can't always be there. There are only 14 of us. So we need to hand over more. We need a cycle of 3 years and then leaving a program or a course or something like that. There are not enough of us.
Right. Any other questions, please? Questions? Yes? Okay.
Sometimes changes in educational systems or components of systems need to come from outside the schools or the universities or the academies or whatever. Does anybody in the here in the room or in the panel have experience with organizing, let's say, support for writing and the importance of writing and the need for attention to academic writing, organizing it through the social partners, the institutions, the companies where our alumni end up. I mean, in many fields like psychology, in my country, and I'm sure it's worldwide, there is a very strong professional organization which has a huge impact on how programs are designed and what the outcome specifications are. We might benefit as a community of academics with an interest in writing from organizing social support from outside universities to have an impact on the state of writing in the universities themselves.
Absolutely.
I could say something about that in the US, because many of our programs, our disciplines have accreditation, their own accrediting bodies, that, and many of them include writing competence. So they understand that there's a way that they're going to need to measure that, and sometimes, many times, they will call me to help them do that. Other times they just say, well, the composition program should have been handling this before. So it's not always positive, but sometimes it is.
And a somewhat corresponding situation for many of our programs, there will be a program board, and industry will be represented on that program board and will guide the learning outcomes for the program, not necessarily the individual courses.
Yeah, we do have similar structures, but I have the strong impression that in my country, in the Netherlands, there is a quite clear distinction between the way universities deal with writing, quite bluntly saying, assuming it's all in place after secondary school, and the way more practically oriented institutes for higher education deal with writing. They tend to take it much more seriously. And I have the impression that it has to do with the more direct links, on the one hand, the more direct links between, let's say, the programs and the places where people go after graduation to work, on the one hand, and on the other hand, perhaps the self-definition of academics who have a discipline and for whom writing is not something separate, but it's embedded in their work, and they don't see it as something separate, and they don't like to see it as something separate.
True.
I'm just beginning a 3-year project with the engineering departments in Queen Mary at University of London. And I think what we see there is that there is quite a lot of expression by academics within the departments, well, some of them anyway, that it's very important for students to have writing in order to go out into the working world. But students themselves don't actually perceive that, and there's a mismatch between what the academics are saying and what the students kind of believe and are interested in. And I think that it's something that came up in one of the presentations yesterday from Paul Richardson, I think it is, that how we can make the kind of writing which is going on in university, which is relevant to university kind of objectives, somehow connect up with the kind of writing which is relevant outside the university. I think it's quite a big challenge and something for us to keep looking at.
Any other questions? Questions?
Nope.
Okay, if there are no questions, I think it's the time for us to actually thank the panelists. Let's have a round of applause.